There was a time in the not too distant past when aging was honored and seen as a natural part of life. Yet in today's world, we've come to fear aging as if it's a dark monster we must fight in order to be loved, seen, and respected. The culture of eternal youth eats away at our well-being on many levels. It creates an increasingly consumptive and expensive demand for youth-fostering surgeries and products. And for young and old alike, the youth culture feeds mental health issues such as low self-worth, depression, anxiety, and isolation. It also fosters ageism and self-ageism, issues that affect us all. The less we honor and embrace every stage of life, the more we marginalize parts of ourselves and our communities. How can we create the understanding, unity, and changes we need? Join me and ageism expert Lindsey McDivitt, writer and advocate for intergenerational understanding, as we explore the importance of joining together to combat ageism. Today, we'll focus on this listener's real-life question. I'm in my late 50s and was let go from my job due to downsizing. I'm a hard worker with a good work history, but I can't get anyone to hire me. I know it's due to my age. Even if I didn't need the money, which I do, I'm not ready to retire. It makes it even worse that I lost my friend group because they were coworkers and I don't see them anymore. I never felt old or lonely until this happened. Is it normal for me to feel mad and depressed? And with that question as the focus of today's episode, I'm Dr. Carla Marie Manly, and this is Imperfect Love.
Welcome to Imperfect Love with Dr. Carla Marie Manly, psychologist, author, and relationship expert. I'm here to help unravel mysteries and misconceptions about love, relationships, and mental health issues, plus everything in between. Love is complicated, people are not perfect, and relationships surely can be tough. Together, we'll navigate this messy, imperfect space of real life.
Today, I'm joined by a very special guest, Lindsey McDivitt, who will be sharing her expertise on aging and ageism. Welcome to the podcast, Lindsey. It's such a delight to share time with you.
Thank you so much, Carla. I'm so pleased to be here.
So, before we launch into the meat of today's podcast, can you tell our listeners just a little bit about what makes you you?
Well, I think that I approach ageism from a slightly different angle than many people. I worked in healthcare with older adults for many, many years. And then, like your listener, I was let go in my latter 50s from my healthcare job. And it was a recession. So I really had to dig deep to figure out what I was going to do next to handle the natural depression and separation from coworkers and so forth. And so I turned to a passion that I'd had for a long time, but never really had the energy or um, the courage to pursue. And I started writing books for children. So my focus quickly became age stereotypes as I started to read picture books and see age stereotypes everywhere.
My goodness, thank you for sharing that with me and our listeners. I didn't realize that there was such a parallel here, that you too, when I matched you and your expertise with this question, I didn't realize that it was very similar to what you had experienced. So I very much appreciate that and know that will bring a great deal to the conversation. The other piece in looking at your website, I really enjoyed seeing how you have been so informed by not only your own work in the realm of healthcare, but also by really foundational people like Betty Friedan and her book on aging and the adventure, so to speak, of aging. And then how you pivoted, as you were just saying, and this to me is so intriguing, that you started looking and even your blog, A is for aging, you're really looking at how even something as simple and as beautiful as a child's picture book promotes stereotypical images of what it is to be an older adult. And thus, that in itself contributes to ageism. It's stunning. So, before we really focus on the listener's question, can you tell us a little bit about what you found in these picture books and when you were starting to look through them and how you see that as connected to ageism?
Well, it was about 12 years ago that I really started to dig into what at that time were modern contemporary picture books. And I was just stunned that so often the child was helping the older adult, and the older adult was frail and dependent, often forgetful, grumpy. Perhaps a child would be, be the one that has to cheer up the older adult. And there was just very little of strength and the benefits of experience and wisdom being shared by an older adult. And I was just incredibly disappointed because I had worked primarily with stroke survivors and been so inspired. I had so many amazing role models. They were just stunning in their ability to be able to accept a life changed so quickly and draw on strengths and amazing resilience. So I just wasn't seeing much of that at all.
And I'm very appreciative because I like learning all the time. And what I've learned from you and looking at what I have so far about your work to shift stereotypes, we often don't see that the children of when you started 12 years ago, let's say it was an 8-year-old reading your picture book. That 8-year-old is now 20 years old.
Very good point.
And that 20-year-old is, very soon going to be making decisions and is already making decisions in voting and all of those things, or very soon will be making huge decisions that will ultimately not only impact today's seniors, but very soon, those policies get in motion and they will be affecting their own, lives in 40 years. And we
Mhm.
don't tend to see that ripple effect. And how you point out so beautifully that picture books, it's the grumpy grandpa or the very, soft cushion-like grandma sitting in a chair, nurturing and that's beautiful. But not every grandma is sitting in a chair with an ample lap, ready to read. She may be out doing her own work to change the world. And so we can see through this magnificent lens that you offer us that stereotyping, that ageism begins in childhood. Who knew?
It absolutely does. And I think if you look at, ageism really flies under the radar. But if you look at sexism, if you look at racism, we all know that kids are influenced from very young, from picture books, from early exposures to adults' attitudes, and from media in many aspects, and they're forming those attitudes that just might last a lifetime, especially if they're not challenged or if they're not exposed to the diversity of people out there. And actually, as we grow older, we become more diverse. Ashton Applewhite, who's written a tremendous book, This Chair Rocks, a Manifesto Against Ageism, she actually talks about how if you know one 80-year-old, you know one 80-year-old. We become more different as we get older. And I find that to be very true.
And I agree with you. If we begin to look at age as the true spectrum that it is, with gifts at every age, and you're right, one 80-year-old is simply one 80-year-old, just like you can have a 20-year-old who's quite lethargic and, wants to sit in their rocking chair, and you can have a 70-year-old, 80-year-old, 90-year-old who has no interest in that whatsoever. But I really like focusing on when we're talking about aging and ageism is that, as you say, ageism goes under the radar. We're all about, me too, and no offenses against people. And I'm behind all of this against marginalizing people of color, marginalizing women. And we forget that we don't want to marginalize the older population because when we do that, we are minimizing the impact they can have on us and our world because there's such intelligence there, such wisdom there, and so much force for good that we can embrace. And when we are, let's call it guilty of ageism, I think what we do, just like when there's sexism, we tend to really marginalize people and thus marginalize the part of ourselves that can learn and grow and connect and unify with another segment of the population that we can embrace as part of our community.
This is very true, Carla. And I think that it's so easy to forget that really we are marginalizing ourselves because if we're fortunate to live a long life, eventually we will be impacted by ageism. And it's something that we can change, and something that we won't realize how painful it is often until we get older, until maybe our 50s. But I also want to make the point that ageism does cut both ways, and young people can suffer from ageism too. That stereotyping and discrimination can apply to somebody who's assigned to a certain generation and proclaimed as lazy, or assigned to a certain age that's considered too young for a job, or many things like that are ageism. It's just that often we don't experience it in a really painful way that we can't really even fight against until we become older.
I appreciate you bringing that up because you're right. In fact, I did a podcast recently with John Schlemm where we were talking about for Gen Z. For many people, they look at Gen Zers and say, oh, they're all lazy, they're all tied to their phones, and that is
Hmm.
ageism.
Hmm.
Anytime we globalize and say this group is lazy or bad or too old or too young, we are not seeing the amazing individuals within that
Hmm.
group. And then we've generalized and we have on these glasses that are very clouded to seeing the individuals. And so I thank you for highlighting many of these important points because as adults, then it becomes our responsibility to start looking at, wait a minute, when I'm buying a picture book for my child, what are the images in there? When I'm talking to my teen about ageism, are they experiencing ageism? What are their attitudes toward younger people? What are their
Hmm.
attitudes toward middle age? What are their attitudes toward later age? And start having conversations about what, many people 1,000 years ago in tribal communities, etc., really saw the elders as carriers of wisdom, as these beautiful holders of sacred stories and all of this wealth of information, whether it was about medicines or passing on the stories or the rituals that were important. And we've lost that partly because we've lost so many rituals in our culture.
And I think also all too often it's so easy just to search something on the internet. We think, oh, I'd like to know this, or I'd like to know more about that, or I have a question. We don't turn to an older adult with more experience. We just search it on the internet. And the other point I want to make is that, yes, I agree with you totally. It's so important to have these conversations starting when our kids are young, and as adults and as older adults to have the conversations about ageism and stereotypes. And um, 2 points. One is we have to all acknowledge that we are ageist. All of us are harboring ageist beliefs, and we have to just root them out and face them and educate ourselves. But the other point is it's really a hard conversation sometimes because we don't have enough information. It's something that we haven't been exposed to. Many people don't understand what ageism really is all about, or they think it is totally pertaining to respecting our elders, not realizing the depth of the problem, and that it can affect so many of us at different ages.
And I agree that it's important for us to look at whatever thoughts, feelings, mindsets are going on inside ourselves that contribute to ageism. start looking at them and, like you said, get to the root, not judge them, but to look and see, oh, when I see this young person, do I think, oh, they're just wasting their time. They're not a committed worker. And when I see this older person, do I think, oh, well, they're just, you know, whiling away their time until they finally pass away or whatever. But again, not seeing the individual, or in the case of the person who wrote in, that somebody may see this individual, see a resume, maybe meet the person for an interview and go, oh, that person's too old. They're going to be too slow. Better let them go now than, or not hire them at all, than to put them in the workforce and have them slowly declining before our very eyes.
Yeah, all too often, aging is just, I guess, really regarded as a time of decline and as someone who's only looking at death. But we have to acknowledge we're aging from our very birth. We're aging and growing and changing our entire lives. And there's nothing inherently bad about aging. And we're also gaining so much. I remember in my early research learning that actually there's a U curve of happiness, and that people at the early ages, like childhood, and at their uh, late adulthood, are the happiest. And it's that middle time of life that can be really, really uh, challenging for many people. And I'm seeing that myself at 66. I feel much happier than I was in those middle years, and feel I still have lots to look forward to.
And I love how you look at that through the lens of it's the individual. There may be people who are 66 or 56 or 36 who feel tired and worn out and, oh, I'm not learning anything. And I've worked with clients where when they're, 29, 30, and they're saying, I don't feel relevant any longer. I really feel as if the young people are already pushing me out. And we want to take care with our mindsets. And it doesn't mean that's not actually happening to them, but realize that we in those middle days of life, those middle years of life, we're
Yeah.
often so focused on producing, getting
Mhm.
the first home or the first apartment, making all these big career changes, making the movements that help us create a good foundation. And then older, life is a time where you can start winding that down a bit and turn energy toward creating more joy, more self-awareness. Not that you can't do it at every stage of life, but sometimes you just have more bandwidth or more time. And so there's this element of older life where people can really do a phenomenal amount of growing and giving back to the world if the world is willing and wanting. I was talking to a neighbor the other day who is retired, and she has realized she needs to get back into the workforce to make enough money. And she went and she interviewed, and she's very well educated. And she went and she interviewed for a gardening position because she thought at a nursery, she thought it would be a lovely fit, just enough money to help her with her bills. And they told her, we don't think it's a good fit. Perhaps go volunteer somewhere.
Mhm.
And this is a highly active, intelligent woman. And you think, my goodness. And that is an act of ageism. And the
Mhm.
individuals who made that decision or said those words likely weren't aware of it. But my goodness, in today's world, I do think that it's important for us all to pause, to look at how we view aging
Right.
and separately. And you are very good at separating.
Mm.
That's part of, your tagline, that there is a difference between aging and ageism. So for our listeners, could you point out the very big difference between aging and ageism?
Aging is something that is normal, that is positive in many regards as we add experience with our years, and apply the wisdom that we've gained. But I think ageism totally turns that on its head, where that person who's been, has been aging and changing themselves, they are viewed as just the same as everybody else at that age. So you could be judged as a large cohort, which sometimes seems to go from like 50 up to 100, or you could be, judged as a baby boomer or so forth, but nobody's looking at you individually and all that you've added to your life over those years. They're just making one judgment on your age.
Beautifully put. And it's interesting, just taking a slight pivot before we get back to the listener's question. In my second book, Aging Joyfully, I talk about self-ageism, and it was a term I coined because I realized that so many of the people I was working with, regardless of gender, but often women, were saying things like, I'm too old for this. Oh, it's too late for me to shift careers. Even at, 39, 45, they were already telling themselves, I'm too old. I don't have the capacity to do this anymore. I've come to it too late in life. Or younger folks saying, I'm too young for this, or my parents are telling me I shouldn't do this because I'm too young. Or I'm telling myself I'm too young. And again, some of that is ageism from others, but we also want to be careful of the voices that are going on inside our own minds that are telling us that we are either too young for something or too old for something, because I am a firm believer that we are never too old to be the person to do the things that we want to do. Of course, taking health reasons and mental health factors into account so that we're safe for ourselves and other people. But I really believe that if we are aware of self-ageism, then we come, or ageism looking out at others, we realize that if we're making judgments based solely on chronological age, that we are really selling everyone short across the
Yeah.
spectrum. Any choice made solely on chronological age is, to me, a pretty ridiculous choice.
Well, you make a good point about self-ageism, those negative stereotypes we take in from all these different sources, the picture books and the TV shows and the movies and ads and magazines, all that is contributing to that self-ageism. And when you see it and you take it in and you believe it, and then it hampers you, not just in how you look at other people, but how you look at yourself. And the choices you make won't be as open, as courageous as they could be. So that's really sad when that happens.
It is very sad because when you did a pivot later in
Mhm.
life, I've did a big pivot at a time where I might have been telling myself I was too old. And I believe that when we have the courage to make those pivots, ignore the chronological,
Mhm.
date on the calendar, the year on the calendar, because what's most important, and research shows this throughout the lifespan, that when we are willing to engage in self-growth, when we are willing to evolve, to continue to learn and continue to grow. That is how we stay. Not as young, because it's not important to stay young. It's important to stay vibrant. It's important to stay curious. It's important to stay in a state of wonder and evolution. And that's why I think the whole fountain of youth culture really doesn't serve us very well at any end of the spectrum, because you see, and we'll take I know I say I'll take it back to the listener's question, but I keep thinking of more thoughts where, you know, in my town, I see billboards all over the place for get this shot, buy this product, do this plastic surgery. Here's
Yeah.
scan this QR code to get payments on this augmentation or this whatever it is. I'm thinking, oh
Mhm.
my God, if I were 20 and seeing all of those messages everywhere telling me at the age of, 15-year-olds are seeing them, and 15-year-olds are one of the
Right.
highest, they're becoming very high consumers of plastic surgeries and Botox and all of this to ward off at that very young age the beast of aging.
Mhm.
And it's frightening, and it does contribute. So now circling back to our listener's question, it does contribute to the ageism that would affect somebody getting laid off prematurely, or if indeed it was solely due to age, or not being hired due to age, because if they're looking at somebody's face or their age rather than their qualifications, they may be saying unconsciously, well, youth is better. So if we're picking between a 55-year-old or 50-year-old and a 25-year-old or 30-year-old, well, we're definitely going to go with the younger one because that person is definitely going to be better. And that's
Right. And
not
all
always
those untrue, stereotypes that come into play there are things like, well, older adults are not tech savvy or not able to learn when it comes to technology, or that they're, not going to be as reliable because they'll be sick, or that they just in general won't be able to learn new information. And the truth is that research is showing that older employees bring a lot to the workplace, and that they are often more reliable, and the whole technology fear is not really there for most older adults. So those are all little bits of that stereotype about older adults.
Thank you for sharing that. And I agree with you. The research shows us that older adults have, again, so much to offer, not just through wisdom and life experience, but cognitively. The diversity of what they have experienced in life, and many older adults are very curious, lifelong learners, that
Mhm.
we don't want to minimize the gifts that come at every spectrum of life. I mean, there are so many gifts that it doesn't have to be this or that. When we become
So
more
true.
unified in any environment, whether it's through genders or races or political diversity, it's what makes the world so beautiful. And when we create harmony with that rather than divisiveness, it helps us all learn from each other because older adults can learn from younger ones, and younger ones can learn from older ones. And it creates this beautiful web that our world really, really needs.
I agree. Totally agree with you, Carla.
So let's take it to the listener's question for a moment. And I love that you have this very real life experience of your own where you were let go. And it sounds as if you went into depression. And so the individual who wrote in said, was she right to feel angry? I think it was angry and depressed. What would you say about that?
Well, for me, it was the middle of a Minnesota winter, so it was very depressing to all of a sudden feel isolated. I think probably one of the most important things is to do everything you can to not be isolated, to find new friend groups, or new colleagues, whether it's in a volunteer position or people that are, you know, in the same boat that are searching for a new job. You need people around you that are going to understand your plight, and you need to be just not feeling alone. And it can be just a very lonely feeling.
And you had also said, if I heard you right, that you lost, I don't know if it was all of your friends or many of your friends because they were in your work group.
Well, I was fortunate to have friends from other areas of my life, but if you are in a role that you love and you've been working there for a while, your colleagues become a very important part of your circle, and they're part of your daily life. So yeah, it's painful. It
And
is.
how did you deal with the pain and the isolation in your
Well,
situation?
yeah. So I initially would take my laptop and go to coffee shops, just being around, the sounds of people and chit chatting. My best friends became the barista just for a while. It just really helped to get out of the house, and to be around other human beings. Once my kids went off to school, and then I actually had to move. So I was moving states also, and leaving behind friends in that regard. So I had to just really force myself to join things, which isn't easy to do when you're feeling depressed. But you just need to get out there and do your best until it starts to feel a little bit more natural, and you meet people you have something in common with.
Okay, what did you force yourself to join?
Trying to remember. 3 book clubs. And while I'm a writer now and I love to read, I've never really liked being told what to read. So I had a hard time with that. Being presented with these are the books we're going to be reading and discussing, but I knew I needed the socialization. So yeah, book clubs were important to me.
Thank you for sharing
Mm,
that because I
mm,
think any time, and I think this for the listener's question is so important because people often form their friendships through work, that's very natural, or
mhm,
through college friendships that have endured over time, or, the person in the house next door, whatever it is. But often, and I hear this from many of my clients, that as they get older, if they've lost a job or have retired or moved, that other people don't tend to open up their friend groups to them, that people seem to have their friendship groups formed by the time they're in their 30s and are quite resistant to other people coming in on more than a peripheral level, if they will even allow that. And I appreciate that you brought up the idea of groups because it does take some out of the box thinking, but by going online, there are so many groups, especially through Meetup, where you can find hiking
mhm,
groups and you can find painting groups and gardening groups. And as you say,
mhm,
book clubs to this doesn't address her question about employment, and we can get into that. But I think that once you get some more friends at whatever level you need. It doesn't have to be a lot of friends. For some people, just having one or two friends feels really, really good. And that
mhm,
can help with mental health. Just that alone, have not feeling isolated. What are your thoughts on that from what you've
mhm.
seen?
Well, absolutely. And I think that I just like to put in a plug for online friends. I try not to spend too much time online, but when you're a writer, it can be a really lonely occupation. And so I never did find that same kind of setting where I was working with colleagues day in and day out. And I relied on finding writer friends through conferences, even online conferences, and through social media, and then connecting with those people. And some of them I've still never met in person, but I depend on them for support and for sometimes for professional advice. So there are a lot of groups out there, and they're not all in person groups, too.
And as much as we might hear that online isn't positive or beneficial or good enough, I am in agreement with you that there are many, as long as you're not feeling isolated by meeting someone on Zoom or chatting, if it's working for you and it's feeling good, then lean into it.
Mhm.
I also don't want to miss the opportunity to comment on you and your relationship with your coffee shop barista because I know how important in talking to many clients who feel alone where they do find a way to, and I advocate for this. Go out to a park where you can sit on a bench and talk to someone who sits down. Go to a coffee shop, make friends with someone in the coffee shop, little light chat or chat with the barista, whomever it is, because most humans really need that connection, at least micro doses of face to face human connection in order
Mhm.
to not feel isolated. Because once you really feel isolated, which is different from being alone, it is a sense of really being cut off from something you need. And sometimes we want to be alone. But if you feel
Right.
isolated, then you tend to turn inward and go down that rabbit hole of that you're not wanting to, but of anxiety or depression. And so much at every age group, but particularly with older adults who socialize and stay connected tend to have really great mental health and
Mhm.
concomitantly good physical health. Whereas at every age, we see those who are more isolated, but again, particularly with older adults, health really declines, well-being declines. So that connection wherever you can get it is so important.
I
And
really like what you say, Carla,
mm,
about micro doses, because I agree with you there. Even, apart from the barista, I remember just having to go into a, a copy shop where I would have to make copies, and do some other things like sending faxes and so forth. And that person also became a major contact when I had to move to a new city. And just having those daily cheerful conversations can pull you out of yourself. And then getting a dog and meeting other dog people, super important.
Absolutely, because when we are feeling more connected, less depressed, less anxious, we tend to have a different kind of vibe. So that
Hmm.
for our listener who may be interviewing at other jobs, if she's interviewing or reaching out when she's feeling really low and depressed, that might come across in an
Hmm.
interview.
Yeah.
Whereas if she's able to make some connections and create some friendships, even the more superficial ones. And I recall
Mhm.
talking to a client who felt so isolated and gone down this rabbit hole and couldn't go outside. When I started working with her, she was really self-isolating at that point. So we talked about what she could do. And what she could do, she was even having her groceries delivered. And what she could do was go to the store and buy a bag of carrots. And that felt like a win for her. So even an excursion to the grocery store where you don't even have to talk to anyone. You can say hello to the checker, but just getting used to having connection can be so uplifting. And
Yeah.
then, so we can start with, as we were saying, micro doses. So taking it to, again, back to the question of the day and the idea of the anger. I don't want to skip over that piece because I happen to hear it frequently where people, wherever the ageism is coming from, the younger end or the older end, but particularly older end because it's so pronounced and seems to make people feel so helpless and thus often very angry. What do you think about the anger aspect of it? And I know there's often a lot below the anger, the sadness, the grief, all of that. What would you recommend?
Yeah, it's definitely true when you're in a situation like that where you're let go or laid off, whatever, that there's a whole ball of wax when it comes to the emotions, and anger is definitely one of them. Even if, like in my situation, it was a recession, and I understood that the company had to make those kinds of hard decisions, and I had felt valued there prior to that. Especially when you're older, you do feel like, perhaps that had, something to do with it, that it was taken into consideration, and that just feels really unfair, and that contributes to the anger, that unfairness, that you feel you're being judged because, you're perhaps one of the older ones on the team. So, talking it over with people who understand, people your age, and I had the benefit of having been exposed professionally to aging and ageism issues. And so I kind of knew where to look for information. So I would say, do some searching if you feel like that was part of the mix, and you'll learn you're not alone. And that does help a lot.
I agree.
Mm.
Processing it, talking about it. If you can't afford psychotherapy, joining a women's group or a men's group. Here's the other piece that I really like that you brought up about making connections. When we have the courage to make connections, we never know which one of those connections, when we're talking about, oh, I need a job or a part-time job or this or that, where somebody says, oh, I know just the thing. I know somebody who's looking for someone full-time. You'd be a great fit. And so we don't ever want to underestimate the power of putting ourselves out there, even though it's
Hmm.
hard when you're angry and depressed, but they're not mutually exclusive. I see the synergy in it because, of course, there are times in my life when I've been angry or blue or whatever, and you almost have to just embrace, discover some inner courage so that you can get yourself out there because no one's going to find you if you're isolated at home.
Hmm.
And so, really working to reach out for that support and then becoming part of the change by getting out there and showing people that regardless of your age, you can shine. You can be this wonderful force in the world. And she's passed away now, but one of my favorite role models when I went back to doctoral school was Marion Woodman, who was a teacher but found her second life. I think she was 56 and created this. She wrote books, and she created the Marion Woodman Foundation and was working with all sorts of things, including helping people with eating disorders and helping people with perfectionism. And I remember when I finally met her, she was just gorgeous. She was probably, I don't know, 84 at the time, and these gorgeous, sparkling eyes, and this beautiful smile, and this luminous skin. And I just thought, oh my goodness, this is a wise, wise woman. And indeed she was. I didn't see age, I saw wisdom and beauty.
I was so fortunate like you in having older role models, and I could remind myself, okay, these people had conquered much more than I was facing, and if they could do it, I could at least take those baby steps. So I think, looking for those role models in your life can help, but also most of us, by the time we get to be in our 50s, we've faced some other tough times, and we can remind ourselves that we got through that. So we probably have the skills to take those early steps, and they will make a difference.
You said
Mm,
one of my favorite phrases, take
mm,
baby steps. And so often when we've suffered a big life change, we think we have to make a massive move, and the massive move, the
mhm.
massive step seems just
Yeah.
too insurmountable. Yet when we look and say, wait a second, I can have this goal of going back to work, of finding a job, of doing this, of doing that. But what about baby steps? And baby steps are so much more doable to the psyche, to the body, mind,
Yeah.
to the spirit. And baby steps are good because on a cumulative level, they do create a giant step. And it's the most wonderful way to just take
Mm,
the baby steps. It's good. It's a good thing.
yeah. And write them down and cross them off and give yourself credit for those steps. That's what I did for a couple of years. Paper calendars too, so you can physically check those things off. I really find satisfying.
Oh my goodness, I'm much
Mm.
the same. I love having my lists and being able to check them off. There's something about the tactile that having it on the
Yes.
computer just doesn't give that tactile sense of
Mm.
achievement. And thank you for calling that out, because I do believe I often talk when somebody has a goal, have a main goal, regardless of your age. And then underneath that main goal, whatever it is, can be big, it can be small, do micro goals. These
Mm.
little, very specific, achievable goals that allow you to, so if you are feeling isolated, your main goal may be, I'm isolated and I want to make friends. So underneath that, it could be look online for groups by this weekend. Then you'll be able to check that off. The next step may be to join one of the groups, I find, by the end of the month. But whatever they are, they do allow a sense of achievement, and that sense of achievement helps the depression and the anxiety move away, because it is creating a sense of empowerment. And I think that that's what's important, regardless of our age, that we have a sense of personal power. And that's one of the saddest parts, and one of the most unfortunate parts about ageism, wherever it is on the spectrum,
Mm.
that it eats away at our sense of personal power, of self efficacy, of agency. And that never feels good.
Couldn't agree more, Carla.
Well, Lindsay, you have brought so much wisdom
Mm.
and just beautiful life experience to us today. Do you have any other thoughts for our listeners?
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed being here and talking with you. I think just I'd like to say, please think about the people in your life that are young and are already taking in those age stereotypes, and make a bit of an effort to expose them to some role models, whether it be through, picture books. Even older kids like picture books, especially true stories. Like today's picture book biographies, I think are quite amazing and have important lessons in them, and are very engaging. So start there.
Well, you have written some amazing books that call out some wonderful. You and I have talked about your, I think it was Christmas for Uma.
Christmas fairies for Oma.
Christmas Fairs for Oma. I love, and that the
Oh,
illustrations in
thank
that
you.
book. But the other books that you've written about older adults who have contributed so much, could you give our listeners just a little dose of those? I think you have three of them.
Well, thank you. Yes, I do. And like I said, they're picture book biographies of real people. One is Nelson Mandela. I was born in South Africa, and I won't share too much here, but it was really important to me to go back to the changed South Africa, the post-apartheid era, and I learned everything I could about Nelson Mandela and how he helped to make that happen and change that beautiful country. And then I have one about President Ford, who was called Truth and Honor, and also one about Gwen Frostic that is she's a nature artist that probably many have not heard of, but she was an early environmentalist. It's called Nature's Friend, the Gwen Frostic story. And I didn't really realize after I'd written these books, I realized that they are all people who accomplished some pretty amazing things in their later life, and really are role models also. So you can get your role models in books, not just in person.
Thank you. Those all sound
Mhm.
like such great reads. And I did want to mention the Christmas Fairies for Uma. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I remember you and I did a podcast on that ages ago. But the illustrations were just so beautiful, but also the message, if I recall correctly, had to do with people in your family who were in South Africa. And you
It's a
were reach.
fictional book, yes, but it's
Yes.
based on a true story. And its theme is kindness. I was separated from my grandparents when I was really young by 10,000 miles and would see them just once every 3 years, yet maintain a relationship through letters. And so this is about, based on a little family miracle, we called it, where a picture of princesses that my sister and I drew and mailed with just gold bond stamps, which have no real value, like coupons. In the book, I use stickers, but it was mailed with not even a full address, just Oma, which means grandmother in Afrikaans, and the city and the country. And yet, somehow, through the kind acts of many people across the world, it kept getting passed on. And it finally, by a miracle, ended up in my grandmother's hands at her doctor's office. And we never knew how that happened. So I always wanted to write about that. The book fictionalizes it, but I know that it's based on kind people that are just keep passing it forward. Um, so the theme of that book is kindness. Yeah, it was a delight to see that with the beautiful illustrations by Katarzyna Bukiert. And to hold that in my hands was a really special moment.
Thank you. You have really filled my heart with that last piece because it took me back to that podcast, and now I recall the reaching to, and it brings the podcast full circle in a way because we're seeing how important it is for youth to be connected to elders and elders to be connected to youth. And when we have that range and that respect at both ends, it creates such community and sacred love. It really creates just this beautiful place for all of us. Again, there's no one's being marginalized in that story at all. In fact, it's about the beauty of kindness and enduring love. And I think that that's such a beautiful message from that
Mm.
book. And I can't wait to see your other works. So thank you, Lindsey. It has been such a joy, such a delight. Where can our listeners find you?
Thank you so much, Carla, for asking me. It's lindseymcdivitt.com, or A is for aging.com will get you to the right place.
And
Thank you.
oh, you're so welcome. And listeners, I have been to Lindsey's website. Be prepared. It's fabulous. It's so personal and so beautiful, but so much information for you to comb through. It's lovely, lovely, lovely. And again, Lindsey, thank you for being with us today. Listeners, there will be lots of information on Lindsey and lots of links in the show notes. And I thank you, listeners, also for being with us today. It's been a joy. And this is Imperfect Love.
Thanks so much for sharing your time with me today. Remember, you have the power to transform your life and love fearlessly, if imperfectly, and it's my privilege to help you along the way. You can find more life-changing content, including my books and other podcast episodes, at drcarlamanly.com. Feel free to submit your own confidential questions through my website. I'll do my very best to include your issue on a future episode. If you found this podcast helpful, please subscribe and leave a review. Until we connect again, this is Dr. Carla Marie Manly wishing you oceans of blessings and love. Please note, this podcast is psychoeducational in nature and is not intended to replace formal mental health support. Please contact your healthcare provider or emergency hotline if you need psychiatric care. And as always, please take good care of your amazing, wonderful self.